Hello, and welcome to The Brief, where every Tuesday at 4:30 Eastern and 1:30 Pacific, Daily Kos founder Markos Moulitsas and I will bring you the most important left-of-center views of the week. I'm Kerry Eleveld, senior political writer at Daily Kos, breakout interviews with Matt Hildreth, director of ruralorganizing.org. And Matt, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about your organization, because I know it's super progressive, but you're focused on, rural and ex-urban voters. So give us a look at that.
Yeah, so we like to say that we're boldly progressive and proudly rural. We're a national organization. We're a 501c4, and we're based in Columbus, Ohio. So we're really interested in bringing that progressive agenda to small towns and rural communities.
So, you work to build democratic support in these Midwestern states, such as Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, others that are really critical, obviously, in the upcoming election. And some of them have, of course, some important Senate races as well. But this is a voting bloc that has typically been a GOP stronghold. So my question to you is pretty simple. Are these gettable voters for Democrats?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I would say is that a lot of the early progressives came from small towns and rural communities, whether that was the Great Plains or whether that was Appalachia. I mean, there's a proud history of that farmer labor movement. And I think that in some cases we've gotten away from that history. We've forgotten that history. And so that's something that I think, just to start with, to say that, yes, there's a lot of rural America that is voting for Donald Trump right now, or has voted for Donald Trump in the past, but it wasn't always that way. And when you ask if voters are gettable, I think the first thing that I would say is that this is going to be a base election. We know that turning out the base is going to be the number one thing that progressives need to do. And there is a progressive base in small towns and rural communities. And I think sometimes that progressive base is ignored. And so I think the first step that we need to do, the first thing we need to do this cycle, is making sure we're turning out that base, whether that's in a big city or a small town. But then also, I think that we need to think about the other demographics that are out in small towns and rural communities that sometimes are left out as well. So, for example, about 20% of rural America are people of color, and we need to be investing in those communities as well, especially when we're talking about North Carolina, Georgia, and other states like that. So I do think that rural voters are more of a swing demographic than we realize. If you look, a lot of those voters that went from Obama to Trump were in small towns and rural communities. And I think that there are voters that are persuadable. We need to be getting those voters where we can. But first, we need to be turning out our base.
Gotcha. So in some ways, this isn't primarily a conversion effort. This is an effort to find the people that naturally would be, interested in democratic values, democratic candidates, and then making sure they have the tools to turn out, and which frankly can be more difficult in some areas of the country, right? In rural areas of the country that aren't as connected oftentimes to the internet. They have, less connectivity, and so that's part of it, right? Am I wrong about that? Or?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think if you look, the voters that I'm really interested in are those Obama no-show voters, or the people that voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012 and then didn't show up in 2016. And I think there's a big misconception out there that rural voters rejected Obama. Actually, rural voters were an important piece of the Obama coalition. And so I think that that we do need to be keeping an eye towards those voters that decided to stay home, and didn't feel like there was a Democratic candidate for them, or maybe they thought they didn't need to vote because they thought the election was already decided. So I think that's a really important piece of it as well. I do think that there's more things that progressives could do to be persuasive for rural voters, but I think this election especially, we have to be turning out the base.
Well, sir, that makes sense, though. I mean, so if you're trying to re-energize, particularly this group of people that were into Obama, voted for Obama, and then sat out in 2016, right? What do you think are the issues that are sort of most important to this group of voters that really, really does sort of engage them and bring them back into the fold. Have you had any success thinking about that?
Oh, absolutely. We've done extensive polling all this last year. We did a sample size of over 7,000 Senate battleground voters in rural areas. And far and away, the number one issue right now is COVID. I think there's a misconception in the media that rural people aren't concerned about COVID. They're very much concerned about COVID. And actually, they're much more concerned about COVID spreading at schools and universities than the economic impact from the shutdowns. And I think those state house protests really were effective at convincing the media that rural people were with Donald Trump on COVID. They're not. And also on healthcare. We see this across, all demographics, but especially in rural areas, people are concerned about healthcare. I think that's something we have to really look at with the Supreme Court situation that we're looking at now, that, their healthcare is on the ballot. And we know that in the states where they expanded Medicaid, more rural hospitals were able to stay open. So I think those two issues are the primary place for us to maybe win over some people that aren't used to voting for Democrats. But also, I think another thing that we really have to be focused on is antitrust, breaking up monopolies. We see that in small towns and rural communities across the country, whether we're talking about dollar stores or Walmart or the agricultural industry. That corporate consolidation is really hurting small towns and rural areas. And rural voters know that. And in fact, some of the things they like most about Donald Trump is his anti-corporate, his anti-corruption rhetoric. And I think sometimes they're actually not hearing that from Democrats.
Right. Interesting. So I know you in our back and forth before we did this interview, I know that you sent me this poll, and just to be clear about the states that you polled, because it's an interesting group of states, right? It's Alaska, Georgia, Iowa, Kansas, Maine, Montana, and North Carolina. Am I right about that?
Yep. And we also did, it's not a Senate battleground, but we also did Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's an amazing, so there's what, at least there's probably a handful of Senate battlegrounds. There's more than a handful of Senate battleground states right there, along with presidential battleground states. So 7,000 constituents in that area is not for nothing, right? That's important.
Absolutely.
Oh, anyway, yeah, that's so. Also, you had sort of a surprising find in this poll, given the most recent news, of course, of notorious RBG, rest in peace. But Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg recently putting a number of things on the line, basically a whole series of regulatory issues that could be turned back by an extremely conservative court that is already out of step with the American people and public opinion, but could be like excessively so, right? But in terms of abortion, which is one of the main things that's it was kind of below the radar, and
right.
Then after Ginsburg's passing, kind of came back up to the fore. What did you find in terms of the voters in this cohort?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've really been seeing is that there are stereotypes that that rural people have towards progressives, but also sometimes that progressives and especially political pundits have towards rural people. And I think if you listen to a lot of the conventional wisdom out there, people think that, picking a Supreme Court justice that's going to overturn Roe v. Wade would be good for rural America. And that's actually not the case. If you look, more rural people oppose making abortion illegal than want to end Roe v. Wade. And I think rural people also have some nuance around identity when it comes to how do they identify versus pro-life versus pro-choice. So that nuance gets to be a little bit hard to understand through polling, but it's very clear that what we've seen is that if the conversation is about outlawing abortion, rural people are going to oppose it. And I think that's something that we really have to keep in mind as we start looking at the next few days and weeks and months.
And there were solid majorities in almost every state that I mentioned, wasn't there? It was close.
Yeah, it's close, but I mean, and this, remember, we're talking about rural or ex-urban voters. So I think the polling I've seen going back to last year would say, 60, 70% of the country is there on this as well. But like, that's also true in rural areas. It's a little bit lower, maybe 10 or 15 points lower than the national numbers, that represent the country as a whole. But it's still above water. It's still, in most cases, I think the majority.
That's great. Okay. So, one thing I've been interested in too is the way in which this new development can give Democrats a chance to refocus on the Supreme Court arguments, the oral arguments that will happen the week after the election, in terms of striking down, this Republican-led case against the Affordable Care Act, right? And so I'm just wondering, do you see an opportunity for engagement there? Since, in particular, you said this voting bloc is really interested in healthcare issues, and COVID is a top concern. Does this give another avenue, another way to sort of get into talking about that and raise the issue of what an extremely conservative Supreme Court could do to the ACA?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest areas, especially around the conversation now with the Supreme Court. I think that's one of the biggest areas where we're missing the mark as progressives. I think we could be having a much more robust conversation about the Republican agenda to end the Affordable Care Act and how that's going to hurt uniquely rural communities and rural people. And, if you look at one of the things that all rural people really are interested in and really support, it's small businesses. And they really want that small business emphasis over major corporations. And if you're a small business owner, especially, we need to expand. I mean, the Affordable Care Act, even if you look at our polling, you can frame it as Medicare for all. You can ask whether or not the government should be responsible for providing healthcare. It's still above 50% in those areas. So the base minimum, I think, is talking about the Affordable Care Act, but healthcare in general, expanding access, that's always going to be a winning issue, especially when it's framed around that economic opportunity message.
You were doing similar organizing. I'm trying to think. Were you doing similar organizing in 2018? I know that before this you were working on immigration issues, but so I just what I wonder is, because House Democrats won a historic sweeping 41 seats in 2018 by focusing on healthcare like a laser beam, and I'm just wondering if you're seeing. You said you wish there were more robust conversation happening among Democrats on this issue. I wondered if you're not quite seeing how the same focus that you were seeing at that time in 2018, or if there are certain candidates that you're seeing the focus from, while other candidates are kind of missing the bus, so to speak.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is all rooted in the idea that it comes from the Beltway punditry, I think, primarily this idea that, well, Republicans win in rural areas. So as Democrats, we should try and look more like Republicans. And that's like the worst thing you could do, because actually Republican policies aren't that popular in small towns and rural communities. What people really like is that Republican sort of branding, but the policies are not popular. And
you say that again. I just want, just for the sake of the DC punditry, I want to hear you say that again, and we'll put it on a bumper sticker. And, maybe we'll start a mass movement. No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, there is a lot of unity in being anti-DC, Beltway. But a lot of what happens, and this is something we see time and time again, is that sort of the corporate agenda is put in place in front of rural people. So what happens is that instead of actually talking to rural people about what they want, sort of a corporate agenda, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, Democrats are doing this too, where they come in and they say, well, we can't have anything nice as progressives because rural people won't go for it. It's actually, that's not the case. They support expanding healthcare. They support economic justice messages. And so rural people, as we know, like with the skew in our politics, have more power per capita in our democracy. And that's something we need to work to change and to fix. But in the meantime, rural people are often the most powerful and most misunderstood voters in our democracy. And so, especially when it comes to the healthcare issue, I think this is where we're seeing this time and time again. In 2018, I think it was a little bit fresher in people's minds that Republicans were working to, cut healthcare, and it was, I think, more of a direct connection to Republicans that were running for office and, being on the record where they stand for votes. I think it's a little bit harder for people to follow the Republican strategy through the courts. And so I think, and then also because the opening arguments are going to come after the election, I think it's a little bit of a different dynamic. But you see this with like how well Bernie Sanders did in rural Iowa among rural white people, and his healthcare message. A lot of times that's like the only thing people like about Democrats is their progressive stance on healthcare. And so I think that the opportunity is there. I think there's still time. I think I think that what we're seeing now with the dynamics changing around the court, it's going to be top of mind. And that's something that I really hope Democrats lean into and recognize just how harmful this is going to be for small towns and rural communities. And like I said before, the states that expanded Medicaid did better than maintained rural hospitals at a higher rate than those that opposed the Medicaid expansion. And the last thing I will say on Medicaid expansion, Medicaid expansion in Missouri outperformed Claire McCaskill in Missouri. And so I think sometimes we're getting this advice from, kind of the DC punditry that is actually disconnected from what we see when actual progressive policies are put on the ballot.
Yeah. So right. So the DC punditry, of course, has this idea, not because they're talking to rural voters, right, but because they're seeing the outcomes of the elections, right? So it's like, oh God, these people are entirely voting against their own best interests. This is, I think, sort of a general mantra among, punditry, whatever, or maybe it's liberal punditry, I don't know. But is it possible to disrupt and tear away the branding from the policies and really get a greater portion of the voters to see that Democrats really are, a model of the policies that would help them most. I mean, it seems like they're aware that that's true, but they still sort of like, many of them, not all of them, of course, but on automatic pilot are pressing R, right?
Yep.
So I just wonder if what is the mechanism of disruption?
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% true. And in addition to this polling we did, where we had this massive sample of battleground state voters, we also did some focus groups, and that's what we were talking to younger rural people and wanted to know their perceptions. I mean, the question we started with is, why are progressive policies so much more popular than progressives in rural America? And a lot of it comes.
Question, by the way, I love that question.
Yeah. And that's the assumption that we make. And we make that assumption based on countless conversations we've had with people, but also how ballot measures do in rural areas, and polling on issues. And when you come at it from that way, you see that, there is this disconnect. Frankly, the Democrats have retreated often, I think, unnecessarily from rural communities. They also think that rural means white. And so they just focus on, old white men in rural areas. And they miss this 20% of the population that is people of color. And so, I think that when you get to the absolute point of the sort of what this is all hinging on, it comes down to this idea of do nothing Democrats. And so often people have this idea of like, yeah, I actually love what the Democrats promise. And I always hear these big promises, but they never do it. And I think that's the thing that we've missed more than anything is like, yeah, there's a population out there that's never going to vote for Democrats, no matter what Democrats do. Fine. But there's a bunch of people out there. And, our motto in ruralorganizing.org is lose less. It's about cutting margins. And for a number of people,
losing less could be the difference, right, between who wins.
Yeah. It's asking a lot. Yeah, it's asking a lot of our organizers if we're saying we want to win. But if it's talking about losing less, we can cut those margins. And if you look, like, for example, I think Sharron Brown is a great example in Ohio. I'm obsessed with people talked about the Donald Trump, Barack Obama voter, but I'm interested in the Sharron Brown Donald Trump voter. And who are these voters that are out there And a lot of them feel like the Democrats walked away from their communities. And a lot of that has to do with Democrats chasing a corporate agenda, frankly, to be, critical of the Democrats. And so if we're going to stand up for workers, if we're going to stand up for people of color, this is how we can, I think, build not just obviously in rural areas, but a coalition that spans rural and urban areas.
So do you think I have to, we probably should get, go reaching the end of our interview at some point here, because I could ask a lot of questions. But let me just get two more in. One is, do you think that the simple lesson of Sharron Brown and the reason he manages to keep winning by such incredible margins in Ohio as a Democratic senator is simply that he doesn't walk away from the conversation with rural voters?
I think Sharron Brown has a reputation of being somebody fighting for workers. And I think that is something that is, very personal to him. I think everybody here knows that that's a priority for him. And so there's a constituency of maybe disgruntled union workers or people that have unaddressed grievances. And they said, I was part of the union. I was a Democrat. And what did that ever get me? And frankly, if you look at how Donald Trump ran in Ohio, he had a very racist message, but he also had this message of the forgotten worker. And I don't think that works against somebody like Sharron Brown. So Sharron Brown will stand up on progressive issues, but he also has this core that is focusing on people who are doing, physical labor for a living, union workers. And I think that that's something that has carried him across. Sharron Brown's not trying to run like a Republican, frankly. He's trying to run like a progressive.
So of course I lied and I said two more questions, but now I'm going to get two more questions, which is, first of all, is Joe Biden running anything in your perception like a Sharron Brown does in Ohio? I mean, because he certainly, Joe Biden can have this sort of righteousness about him when he talks about the, forgotten worker, and when he talks about, the punditry saying that I'm the first guy who's not going to have an Ivy League education. Well, guess what? We're just as good as anybody. Us working guys are just as good as anybody. I wonder if that's breaking through, do you think, to more voters?
Yeah, at the beginning of the year, I said there's Joe from Scranton and then there's Joe from DC. And depending on which Joe shows up, I think could have a lot to do with the outcome of the election. I will say the comment that you just mentioned, the comment about not having an Ivy League education, hit me as like very effective with this demographic. I mean, it's kind of like, are we the party of the working people or not? And the working class is the most diverse class in America. And I think that having that message, that race class narrative that incorporates that working class identity is really effective. And I have seen that more from Joe Biden than maybe I would have expected at the beginning of the year. And I think that that's been effective. And I think the next step then is carrying that sort of sentiment into an actual agenda. That's why one of the things that we're really pushing at ruralorganizing.org is this Office of Rural Prosperity. We want a national Office of Rural Prosperity like Governor Kelly has put in Kansas. And I think that if we can tie that sort of working class identity, working class sentiments with an actual agenda that people can see themselves in, I think that's where we're going to really have success.
That would be amazing. So I think of that sort of monologue that Joe Biden was doing about that as, Donald Trump, you can take your golden toilet and shove it. That's kind of how I felt like. That's not what Biden said. That's my characterization of it. But anyway, so listen, on a final note, I know your super PAC is doing work in different states too, in terms of placing signs and other things. And I know one of those places is Iowa. There's other states as well. How are you feeling if there was a, one or two, I don't know, I don't want to limit you, but if there were some red leaning states that were Senate battlegrounds where you thought Democrats have a real shot there based on what you're seeing from your perspective, your organizing perspective, because you're in a lot of these states.
Yep.
Do you have a one or two pick on that?
Iowa's looking pretty good and pretty close. I don't predict elections anymore after 2016, but I will say I've been really happy with what's happening there on the ground. I think that there's Like you mentioned, we have this pack that it's a little bit old school, a little bit new school. We're trying to place thousands and thousands of yard signs. We actually believe that yard signs work. But also just the organizing that's happening from multiple organizations in Iowa has been really good. Also, we're involved in Kansas. Our ruralorganizing.org is involved in Kansas. And it's been really interesting to see the energy there ever since like post-Kobach. The energy in Kansas has been really interesting to watch. And so I'm not going to be doing predictions on that. But the other thing I will say is if you look at the states that consistently outperform rural numbers nationally, Montana, the organizers in Montana are, first class. And I think they're doing some of the best rural work across the country. So Montana is another one that I always look to, not just for the election results, but for the sort of new ideas on this stuff, because they're always a couple of years ahead of everybody else.
Thank you so much for joining us for this inaugural interview on The Brief. We really appreciate it. Matt Hildreth of ruralorganizing.org. And if you want to see more interviews like we just had with Matt Hildreth, go ahead and sign up for our YouTube channel, but then also tune in live every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time and at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Time. We're going to take a left of center look at all the things going on and give you some different viewpoints that's a little outside of the normal DC punditry. Okay, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Kerry Eleveld signing off from The Brief at dailykos.com.